Once this happens, the world changes for Bitcoin. Every single thing that everyone understands about Bitcoin changes after the ETF gets approved. What happened to gold after GLD was approved was that gold had 8 consecutive up years, right? 8 consecutive up years. And gold is an asset where I can manipulate the supply of gold pretty easily. Bitcoin is an asset where I cannot manipulate the supply very easily, cannot manipulate the supply at all. So therefore, Bitcoin, this is what happens. When an asset gets securitized, it will keep adjusting its price to the upside until we find a moment where capital can get saturated enough into the asset. But how do you reach a point of capital saturation when you cannot affect the supply of an asset?
All right, everybody, welcome to today's show. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce Mr. British Hodl. Welcome to the Why Bitcoin Show.
Listen, thanks for having me. What a name for a show. Why Bitcoin?
Absolutely. Well, there's a little bit of a story there. So one of my kind of favorite people in the Bitcoin space, a fellow by the name of Wiz, or Wizard of Oz here in Australia, I came to him at the last Bitcoin conference in Australia, and I said to him, listen, man, I'm going to start a show. It's called the Why Bitcoin Not Crypto Show. And he said, can I give you a piece of advice? I was like, all right. He says, drop the no crypto. And I was like, oh, what does this guy know? And then did a bit of triangulation, and then eventually decided to do that because a bit long.
Yeah.
And then I'd actually rather focus on why Bitcoin, not why not crypto. Anyway, bit of a story. Hodl, I've listened to some of your stuff there, and I don't want you necessarily to repeat the whole story, but I loved how you and I kind of come from the same class of 2020. You came from a kind of gold bug lens. I came from a sort of more value investing type of lens. And you describe how during the worldwide flu season, you were walking around listening to the Bitcoin standard, and something that Safe was saying absolutely resonated with you, namely the stock to flow. Talk to us a little bit about that sort of like moment when it kind of hit you in the face, and what the significance of that sort of statement is in the context of Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, have you ever had the moment where like you've believed something your entire life, everyone in your circle is telling you one thing, for people you respect. I'm not just talking about morons. I'm talking about multi millionaires who are doctors, lawyers, investment advisors, telling you something you respect, or telling you something, you respect them, you believe it. And then everything that you've ever trained in, everything that you ever understand, someone just says one sentence and it just makes you realize that all of those people that you trust are wrong. That's what happened to me, because I started off in real estate, went at equities, then was in gold at that time. And then when he mentioned stock to flow, it was like the matrix just opened up for me, because I realized that the way I was looking at Bitcoin was an equity. And I should have been looking at it like a commodity with a finite supply. And as soon as he said that, my world just, it fell apart and built itself up again.
I suppose credit to you for having that ability for your paradigm to be shifted, because I think a lot of people, even the late Charlie Munger until his dying days, sort of continue to believe that Bitcoin was rat poison squared, or one of the most deplorable things ever. So I think as a starting point, you need to have that open mind and that willingness to be persuaded. But yeah, I mean, I suppose,
for me, where that came from? It was the fact that even though I was in real estate, I knew the real estate wasn't the asset. I knew the debt was the asset. And I was lucky knowing that, because I started my real estate investing work that I was doing in that field in 2005, which is 2 years before the credit crunch. And it was just, if I had not had started in real estate at that time, in that particular year, I would have thought that real estate was the asset. But because I started then, because I was with mortgage brokers that were just looking to structure deals, because I was with valuers of buildings who were just looking to structure the deal to get the right amount of debt out, because I realized how we were structuring property deals, because of everything that lined up in that 1 year of starting at that specific moment 2 years before the credit crunch, I understood that the asset wasn't the underlying asset. The asset was actually the debt market attached to the asset. And that's allowed me to make the pivots that I've made in life to keep moving forward.
Let's unravel that a bit there. So when you're talking about the debt being the asset, are you talking about how it was securitized and packaged up in mortgage-backed securities?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And
So for example, like I'll run you through quickly a deal that type of deal that we would do, right, with real estate. It was a new build property, so no secondhand stuff. And with new build properties, let's say there's a valuation on that property of 100,000, right? Just to keep it simple. I would go and negotiate that I'm going to buy that property for 80,000 because the person needed to sell it quickly to clear it off their books. We would then go to the banks and say the valuation is 100,000. I want 90% of the 100,000. The bank would say, okay, because 90% mortgages at that point were absolutely fine. And on the day of completion, the bank would give me that 90,000. I would pay the 80,000. I'd have 10 grand left over. Where did that come from? Where did that 10 G's come from? Because if it's not attached to the property in any way, if no one's actually looking, what's your purchase price on the property, then really they don't give a shit, right? What they care about is the debt that they're issuing. They don't care about the underlying asset. The underlying asset is just an excuse to issue the debt. So that's a very simple example, but as a result of working in that and figuring that stuff out early, I was able to understand that really the debt cycles are what's important. And then, of course, my first ever experience of a recession was 2008. So once you go through that and you realize, okay, this type of thing only happens once every 70 to 80 years. You know, nowadays I look at young people that are trying to go through 2020 when there's free money flowing within 3 months of a problem. And it sort of makes me feel sorry for them because I wish they went through 2008, because if you went through 2008 and made it to the other side, you're infinitely more resilient than any of this, you know, baby recessions we're going to have for the rest of our lifetime.
when you say baby recessions, the idea that whenever things get, because the levels of debt are so high, whether it's debt to GDP and various other factors, the government's natural response is always going to be to print more money, and because people are
Yes,
not
but
equipped.
Yes, but the reality is nothing will just be as serious as 2008. 2008 was extremely serious. 2008 was a systemic, serious risk to the entire world stopping within a week. Nothing has come close to being that dangerous. Nothing has come, like, you know, the majority of the banks in the United States are very well, have a good, healthy amount of liquidity based on the rules that were changed after that date. So there's just nothing going to be as serious because we have, you know, we have a little bit of a memory as humanity. Yes, we're going to print more money, but nothing's ever going to be like focused and as serious in our lifetime. We might get to the point where in like 60 years that happens, and hopefully I get to experience another one of those because I'll be ready this time. But you know, I don't like all of these. Every recession between now and then is going to be a baby recession. It's not, the money's just going to flow. You know, it's never going to be systemically focused in the way that it was. And yeah, we'll just continue as we are.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And I suppose just to sort of tie a bow on the real estate piece, because this is something I've spent the better part of a decade in, largely commercial. Talk to us a little bit about like your pitch to whether it's young people who are looking to get on the property ladder, or whether it's seasoned property investors who have multiple investment properties who are geared up to their ears. How do you go ahead and pitch them and say, look, forget real estate, Bitcoin's the one?
Well, I don't tell them to forget real estate, right? Like just like my parents. My parents have spent 35 years building a property portfolio. I was in real estate. So I don't tell anyone to forget the asset that has, you know, allowed them to live the life that they've lived, allowed them to have the security that they've had. What I would implore people to study is why that asset actually went up, number one. And number two, why you actually got into that asset in the first place. A lot of people say they got into real estate because everyone's just going to need houses. That's the BS that Wall Street told you when they wanted you to sell you debt. The reason why you got into real estate is because of the scarcity around houses. That's it. So really the asset that you are playing with is scarcity and then debt on that scarcity. That's it. So if the asset is scarcity, then you need to keep an eye out for what has more scarcity, because clearly if the asset is all about scarcity, then if something has more scarcity, then eventually it's going to be worth more than the asset with the most amount of scarcity. And that's really the starting conversation around Bitcoin. Bitcoin is about scarcity. It's about storing your energy. And at some point, real estate will have the juice squeezed out of it, because peasants also need properties to live in, and governments like to be elected. And unfortunately, we live in in most countries, we live in a democracy where, the peasants have the majority of the vote, right? And I'm speaking as an elitist here. Of course, being British, I got to play the role a little bit. But we're dealing with a world right now where the vote and the direction of the world is based on the majority. And unfortunately, the majority, just think about the average stupid person that and then realize that the 50% of the population is stupider than that person, right? And what we're doing is saying that I'm going to allow the future of my assets and the future of my wealth and the future of everything that I've ever built up to be handled and voted on by that 50% majority, and then decide whether you want something that's a little bit more protected. And ultimately, my parents had to face this, right? They spent 35 years, both immigrants to the United Kingdom, done everything, followed every rule, did everything right to protect and build a legacy for their two sons, only to realize that their property portfolio would have to be worth 50% more than it is because of the amount of pounds that were printed that didn't find its way into real estate. So your property portfolio has probably grossly underperformed unless you own like prime real estate, like beachfront property or something like that. Your property portfolio has probably grossly underperformed the amount of pounds that were printed or the amount of dollars that were printed. And so you need to assess and say, okay, do I want to keep myself in this situation, or do I utilize the asset base that I've built up like my parents did? And they basically refied and bought one Bitcoin for every property that they own. The tenants pay for that Bitcoin, and they continue, and the wealth just continues to grow. I don't really go into the argument of trying to tell somebody to get rid of their property portfolio, because there's so many good ways to leverage a property portfolio to acquire some Bitcoin.
Totally. And I think that's fair enough. And I suppose everyone's different stages in life, different risk appetites, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, I guess people have a sort of bias towards assets that have actually treated them well, relatively speaking. But I think, and then also when it comes to a lot of Bitcoin maximalists, they'll say, oh, there's no need to own your own home. But I can actually just say, having moved seven times, in the last 5 years, there is something awesome about owning your own property and living in it. When it comes to investment properties, I really struggle to see any case just on a risk return basis and the amount of effort and, the juice is not worth the squeeze for me. But to own your own home, I still think it's a valuable sort of thing. And Bitcoin is probably the best single way for you to get to save that deposit necessary to get on that property ladder, if that's your goal, for me.
Yeah, I mean, for me, any property that you own, you should not have any debt attached to it. It should be structured in trusts and in legal ways to allow you to have full defense against anything that's coming. I think that it should not be classed as a part of your portfolio. For the record, I don't own any properties right now anywhere in the world. But at some point when I get married and have children, I absolutely will, because it depends what type of future you want. Any Bitcoin maxi that's talking about, don't own your own home I've never seen a successful empire grow from from a base that just keeps moving, right? There's always a ground, there's always a place for people to feel at home, to feel safe, etc., etc. And I don't think that should form part of any portfolio thinking. I think it should just be an investment you make, and it basically sits there and allows you to build the family and the future offensive that you and your last name want to put onto the world.
Totally. And I'm really glad you went in that direction, because I did want to talk to you about dynasties. I've heard you mention that before, and it's something that not a lot of people, either they're not necessarily aspirational enough to an extent, or it's not something that one tends to think of very often. But talk to us a little bit about that idea of how Bitcoin is potentially a vehicle for us to create generational wealth and to become the future Rothschilds. I mean, it's not necessary, won't be the Carnegies, but let's call ourselves baby Carnegies, or whatever the case may be, of 50 to 100 years from now.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the reason why those families are those families is because they managed to grasp onto industries that were going through the adoption curve, right? And so with Bitcoin, you have now the ability to go through the adoption curve without being constricted based on your financial ability right now. Bitcoin's the first asset. Like when I was in gold, right? I was buying ounces of gold. I was paying a 1 to 3% premium on that ounce of gold. If someone who is in the working class or the poor class wanted to buy a gram of gold, they've now got to pay a 40 to 60% premium on that gram of gold. So in order for me to be in the money, in the profit on my gold investment, it had to move up 1 to 3%. For somebody who's poor, for their gold investment to turn a profit, it's got to move up 40 to 60%. Right? Because they're basically handing over $100 and getting back $50 worth of gold. And so this is the first time in human history where you have an asset that you can do that with. Because even a poor person wants to get involved in real estate, either they got to take on too much leverage or they got to save up for such a long time to buy that house. And then the house value has gone up. So they got to keep saving. It's this never achievable dream that people have. Whereas with Bitcoin, whether you are a multi-billionaire like Michael Saylor, a multi-millionaire like myself, or someone literally on the street, there is maybe a 1.5% percentage point difference between my purchase price and your purchase price.
Absolutely. And another way to almost frame it now we're going down that path is like, Bitcoin is almost like this, I mean, as Saylor likes to describe, the scarce digital real estate where you can own it in fractionalized. And that's one of the beauties, because I guess, yeah, if you wanted some exposure to real estate, there's a big challenge there. There's capital constraints and all that jazz. And Bitcoin does offer that ability. And being a system with, with rules and no rulers, doesn't matter whether you're a sailor or the pleb on the street, you can't really influence the outcome. Yeah,
I wanted to take a second and just apologies for interrupting. I wanted to take a second and just talk about the dynasty approach, right? And how do you become a Rothschild or a Carnegie or someone like that?
Let's go.
The reason why they managed to actually do that is because they're the ones who owned the asset and controlled it. With Bitcoin, it's really almost the first time in history where if you are a normal person, you have the ability to own and control an asset. A lot of people think they own and control their property portfolio. They don't, right? They might own it. They might be the legal owner, but they have debt attached to it, right? Plus, you can't just pick up your property and move it, as you know, with your history with South Africa. My dad's from Kenya and Uganda, so all of the history that's happened there, you can't just pick up your property portfolio and move it to somewhere with better property rights. With Bitcoin, I can do that, right? So if I want to move my Bitcoin from London to Dubai, for example, it's like 10 minutes and it's in Dubai, right? So that's a huge, and by the way, in that 10 minutes, I don't have any slippage costs. I don't have any transfer cost. Like, okay, I got a little bit of transfer costs, but I don't need to hire security teams. I don't need to hire people to do it. I can just move it from one place to the next very, very quickly. So that allows you, it's the first asset where normal people have the ability to have control and ownership over their wealth and their energy that they've spent their time earning. And that's how you become a future Rothschild or a Carnegie, because you set a vision, you set a mission, you have the resources that move in that direction, and then you have the people. The one thing that we're all missing right now in the world, and we can see it in all the data that's coming out everywhere, is the demographic issue that we all have, right? Now, that's going to be slightly plugged with the idea of AI, because one person will be able to have the productivity of 4, but still, the people who really want to take over the world, you will need children, you will need people in order to do that. And they'll all just need to be smart enough to use that AI. It's like now, instead of having 4 children, you could have one child that does the productivity of 4 children, right? But that doesn't mean that you don't have the 4 children, right? That's, you got to have 4 children, and it's going to feel like you got 16 kids. That's how it's supposed to be.
Totally. So in summary, you need to grok Bitcoin, and then you need to have lots of children. Not, well, in a relative sense, you might not need the amount of kids that you had in the past. I've heard you talk about how typically, these dynasties had multiple children, which is true. And everyone within the family has a different role. And I think something that a lot of us Bitcoiners don't spend enough time thinking about is getting our Bitcoin in the right structures to not only protect our assets, and then doing enough education, whether it's with our spouse or with our kids, so that they understand what they own. Because what could be more devastating than spending your life, stacking Bitcoin and really sort of delaying gratification in many ways. You could buy an island, you could do whatever the hell you want, but you're trying to create generational wealth, only for some sort of shithead 21-year-old to go and blow it on Maseratis and all sorts of stupid consumer purchases. So you really got to.
Hey, listen, buy it on. Listen, all I know is I would much prefer a wife who bought Hermes Birkin bags rather than Louis Vuitton bullshits, right? Because at least Hermes Birkin bags, you buy them for 30,000 a bag, and they're worth 80, right? That's a much smarter woman than a woman that buys Louis Vuitton, as far as I'm concerned. So as far as all of that's cool. The key thing that I've been studying, and again, this is something I'm thinking about in my life right now, so it's at the front of my mind in terms of having a conversation about it. But the thing that I've been thinking about is the reason why the Rothschild name turned into what it is because he had the balls to direct the purpose and the mission that last name was on. Nowadays, what we get, and again, to a certain extent, I also went through this where the direction isn't as clear, where I've got to find my own direction, right? The thing that he did was very simple. He had, a lot of children. He put 5 of his sons in 5 different European cities and said, grow the banking empire from those cities. And that's how they managed to take over the world. Now, you might be able to do that with less children nowadays, right? Because of the AI and everything else and everything being online. But you're still going to have people, and they're still going to be focused on one mission, and a mission that they find pride in. The problem is a lot of young people don't find pride in their last name anymore. They don't know what it means. They don't know about the fact that, what their parents have been through. And hey, they might have justification in that. Their parents might not have been through shit. There's people who spent the New Year's getting drunk instead of acquiring 1 Bitcoin and getting to that 1 Bitcoin. And why would I celebrate that person's last name? You're a fucking failure. You chose getting drunk over protecting your progeny and the direction of your last name. What is there to celebrate about you? So unfortunately, that child that comes down that line is now going to have to do the hard work of creating that value themselves. And guess what? They're going to be set back because of one person's decision today. And a lot of us have had family members. We're not all lucky like royal families or whatever else, or business magnate families, etc. We're not all lucky, right? My dad's, for example, got kicked out of Africa because he was Indian, right? Got kicked out. So he had to drop everything that they were building over there and come and build in the UK. You don't think that was a setback? So we all have setbacks, but you have to realize that your decisions today are going to affect your progeny tomorrow. And unfortunately, every asset that we've ever experienced has basically allowed you to pass the buck on to the next person carrying your last name. Because if my dad bought 10 properties in London when he was 18 years old, guess what? I can still buy 10 properties in the UK. It might not be in London, but it might be in another city. It might be in another part of the world, which will have the same effect as London had over the next 30 years. But with Bitcoin, it's different because there is only 21 million. So if my dad had bought, let's say, 10 Bitcoin back in the 1970s, let's imagine it was here, there is no way outside of the miraculous of me becoming a multi-billionaire for me to buy the same 10 Bitcoin. That is the decision that people are facing today. So if you own a bunch of real estate, let's say you own $1 million of real estate, but you can't bring yourself to buy 1 Bitcoin, which is 0.45% of that portfolio, right? You can't bring yourself to do that. I don't know whether you deserve that. I don't know whether you deserve to manage the risk that you have. So therefore, you will be repriced. At the end of the day, you've got to stay focused on what this whole thing is. And the whole game isn't just acquiring money, right? That's not what we're doing here. It's acquiring energy, protecting energy so that it can be utilized in the future to dictate the direction of the world that I want it to go in. And I'll say that again. I is very important, right? Not we. I, because it's my wealth. It belongs to my last name. Therefore, I get to dictate where it goes in the world. And if you don't have enough Bitcoin, you'll just be lining up like a normal peasant, like you are exactly right now, because you're not focused on acquiring the hardest, scarcest asset humanity has ever created.
Totally. Whether we like it or not, economic power is what precedes your ability to influence the world on a big scale. And that's part of my motivation, as I've always said on the show, to acquire fuck you money, not to buy things. I don't need that many things, but for me to be able to change the world as I'd like to change it. And I have some rather ambitious goals involving buying a game reserve in Africa and trying to preserve some pristine wildlife. I'm not going to be able to do that unless I have minimum 20, 30 million US. So, but Bitcoin's the solution. Really love that sort of little sort of side path we went on there. Super interesting. Something you've mentioned as well in the past, and this is a topic that I've actually discussed at length with a mentor of mine here in Australia, Sir William of Rotherham. And it's the idea of Bitcoin as pristine collateral. And I'd love you to just unpack what that means to you in light of the fact that a lot of us believe that the answer long term is not to sell your Bitcoin for fiat, but rather to leverage against it in the future.
Yeah, Bitcoin's the type of asset where if I'm in London and I own a bunch of Bitcoin, I can move it to another part of the world, generate liquidity on it without any slippage on that investment, right? Or on that capital rather. There is normally with real estate, you have slippage. You've got roofs that need doing. You've got, carpets that need replacing, or you've got morons that just don't know how to use the kitchen, right? And you need to replace the kitchen, for example, or whatever it is. With stocks, you also have slippage, right? With stocks, the majority of the slippage comes from, the risks that the company might take to devalue your investment. Then you've got obviously capital gains and taxes that allow that cause slippage across all of these investments. And of course, the smartest people don't ever sell their assets. Bitcoin, on the other hand, is one of these pure things that comes along once in a while. And if I'm in London and I want to generate finance on my Bitcoin, I can turn around and call a bank in London and say, hey, I want some financing. And they'll say, fine, we'll give you it at a 5% interest rate, for example. And they'll say, cool, I'll call you back in a second. Call New York and say, hey, I got this Bitcoin. London just offered me 5%. And they'll say, we'll give you 4.5% because we want the business. Now I call Singapore and Singapore says, oh, fuck London and New York. We'll give it to you for 3%, right? And then I call a bank somewhere else and just democratize all of this finance, and that there's no slippage on the investment. And no matter what I do, I can't harm the investment just by holding it. So that to me is just a phenomenal thing. I've never seen anything like it, even gold, right? Because in order to move gold, let's say I want to generate financing on gold in Singapore from London, I got to move that damn gold from London to Singapore. And that's going to cost me millions of dollars to do, or depending on the amount of gold that I have, right? This is all extremely important. It's the first time that finance has ever experienced an asset. If they want to, if a Singapore bank wants to loan on $100 million New York property portfolio, they got to have, and they don't have offices there. They got to have a team on the ground. They got to do their own research. They got to need to understand the local market. They need to do so much work just to gain access to that, not including the regulatory work that's required as well. So with Bitcoin, I can see a future where people just get told, hey, put your money into Bitcoin and we'll loan against it from anywhere in the world at any time, because as long as you can send a transaction, it's basically pristine. We can see that it's there.
Yeah, I never thought about it from a jurisdictional perspective. And, drawing on my real estate background, it'd be like the equivalent of, let's say you want to invest in a property over here in Australia and you want to get finance from a company in, Spain. Some sort of bank in Spain. I mean, like, think about all the hoops they're going to have to jump through. They're going to, to register their name against the title deeds, to be able to do all of that, the due diligence, all that kind of jazz. Think about what that process looks like for you to get finance from overseas. Whereas, yeah, to your point, I mean, literally the ability for you to actually shop around in different jurisdictions, because what I'm assuming they could do, as an example, is you go, all right, I want to borrow 100K. You put up your Bitcoin, and you say, all right, let's talk to different banks. And then they just issue stable coins. And so literally within 10 minutes, you have your 100K, or, 20 minutes or whatever it might be. I think that's quite phenomenal. How much of that is contingent upon the banks necessarily understanding Bitcoin as being the scarce asset on earth? Or do you think they just don't necessarily have to care because it is capable of being liquidated 24/7 too? So they'll just over collateralize?
Yeah, they don't. It's not their job to worry about that, right? And again, I'm not saying that they don't worry about that, because I had people telling me BlackRock doesn't understand Bitcoin. I was like, are you a moron? Are you actually a stupid fucking moron telling me that BlackRock doesn't understand? This was like a couple of years ago, right?
Mm.
The CIO of BlackRock at the time, I think his name is Rick Reeder, was on CNBC in 2020 saying, we could see Bitcoin becoming gold 2.0. At that moment, right? This is when I divested all of my gold. So he said that in 2020 or something like that. And 17 days preceding that or after that, there was outflows from the GLD gold ETF. 17 days of consistent outflows. And I was like, okay, we're done. So from that moment, I knew that BlackRock was focused on Bitcoin in some sort of way. The banks were coming at that point. I had people telling me, oh, BlackRock doesn't understand Bitcoin. I'm like, they've got enough money to hire 200 full-time nerds that are, one of them is smarter than every Twitter nerd that you know, including myself. And they're going to sit there and figure out what Bitcoin is for the next 3 or 4 years before they make a move on it. And that's exactly what happened. But yeah, listen, I think that they don't care at that point, right? At that point, what they care about is the stability of the asset, the volatility on the asset, and the ability to generate liquidity on it. The problem with a home is that if I take property as collateral and suddenly volatility goes downward, it's going to take me 6 months to sell that property.
Yeah.
So I can't generate liquidity on the asset. Whereas it's much better for me to use Bitcoin because if I ever need to do a call in on the loan, I can go into the market and within a few days, depending on the amount of Bitcoin it is, I can sell it and generate some liquidity on the market, right? And that's why Bitcoin will become that asset. It's not going to happen in a year, right? So this is what I'm talking about here is going to take time. Bitcoin's obviously going to be worth multi-millions of dollars in order for this to make any sense to anyone. The volatility is going to have to go down. The compound annual growth rate is going to have to go down, et cetera, et cetera. But this is what is coming for Bitcoin. It is going to be a collateralized asset. It is going through right now the process of securitization. We should have an ETF in the next week or so, right? A spot Bitcoin ETF. And this is the start of this process. Banks love Bitcoin. They will love Bitcoin because unlike real estate, unlike stocks, unlike anything else, they can generate liquidity at any time. It's a worldwide market. They don't need to worry about it. Because if you want, let's say you got Apple stock that you put up as collateral, and Apple does something stupid. They need someone that to purposely buy Apple stock.
Yeah.
It'd be much better if you just owned S&P 500 index funds, right? Because if you owned S&P 500 index funds, if they ever need to generate liquidity, everyone wants to buy S&P 500 index funds. And that's what it is with Bitcoin, right? That Bitcoin is like the S&P 500 index fund. It is the total market. Whatever's being built on it is irrelevant. It's like, if the internet has a problem, or let's say an internet company has a problem, right? Like Apple, people still want to buy the internet because they still see a future on the internet. That's what Bitcoin is becoming. It is the underlying asset. And yeah, banks don't care. All they want to do is generate liquidity as fast as possible on any loan they make.
Yeah, and as you described, and then I'm starting to think, okay, well, you've got the banks, but then you'll get these sort of neo banks, and then you'll get other types of sort of institutions that will pop up, and each will have different types of offerings. I already know of something that's sort of in the works here where you sort of can hand over your Bitcoin, obviously not your keys, not your coins, but they'll say, look, it's here, it's on chain, it's not going to move, etc. And you need to borrow X number of dollars for a period of 4 years because we know that Bitcoin's annualized return is such that the lowest return you've enjoyed over any 4-year period is over 100%. So we feel comfortable loaning you this much money based on the Bitcoin you've given us. And then we'll obviously just charge an interest rate for this period. And at the end of the 4 years, we'll deduct all the interest, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm very excited.
Or you just refi.
Yes, exactly. And I think I've always, when I heard Saylor first describe that, and it must have been in 2020 or 21, how he spoke about how the richest families on earth, they're not sitting there selling their real estate. The people who bought Manhattan real estate. And I actually had the privilege of working with quite a few of these old families when I was in real estate technology. And this is just generation after generation who have owned properties in the heart of Manhattan. Manhattan's not going anywhere. And there's no sense in paying that down. And every year it gets sort of repriced, they can just draw down, and it's just tax efficient and they never need to sell. So I guess that's how, I would look at Bitcoin as pristine collateral. You mentioned this ETF rather, I almost said FTX, which I heard we spoke about yesterday. So this ETF now looks set to be approved within the next week. There are 14 issuers. One of Coinbase is the custodian for 90% of those, despite having a whole bunch of litigation against it from the SEC. Talk to us about your thoughts in relation to, I suppose, the ETFs. I mean, by the time this comes out, British, as we spoke in the beginning, you're going to prove to be either a genius or something slightly less, because yeah, we'll probably know by then, but you never know with the SEC.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm leaning on, so just for the record, we're recording this on the 4th of January, right? So just to give people context. I'm leaning on the probabilities that have been published by James and Eric, the Bloomberg intelligence analysts on the ETF. I had a conversation with James and understood his theory around why they're 90% certain that the ETF is coming by the 10th of January. So I'm leaning on that. I definitely think that, I've been saying this last year, I think that we will have a spot Bitcoin ETF in 2023. And I also said, for all the trolls on the internet, that if it comes in the first, few weeks of January, I'm still going to consider myself right. So you guys can have a filled day trolling me in the comments around, oh, it's 2024. You ain't going to take that away. I'm not going to take, 2 weeks away from me. But here's my thoughts. It's time for an ETF. The US court system has delivered the SEC a smackdown like I've never seen in my lifetime when it comes to a regulator getting smacked down in the way that they did. The conversation has gone too far. If they were thinking of denying, they're not having the conversation around, is it going to be a cash create or an in-kind or this, that, and the other. They're certainly not what's going to happen, what's been happening today, which is all of these providers filing their 8A forms, which is one of the final steps before they get listed and start trading. So all of the outlook looks towards approval, right, in the next week or by January 10th, in the next 6 days. Once this happens, the world changes for Bitcoin. Every single thing that everyone understands about Bitcoin changes after the ETF gets approved. What happened to gold after GLD was approved was that gold had 8 consecutive up years, right? 8 consecutive up years. And gold is an asset where I can manipulate the supply of gold pretty easily. Bitcoin is an asset where I cannot manipulate the supply very easily, cannot manipulate the supply at all. So therefore, Bitcoin's, this is what happens. When an asset gets securitized, it will keep adjusting its price to the upside until we find a moment where capital can get saturated enough into the asset. But how do you reach a point of capital saturation when you cannot affect the supply of an asset? So then I think Bitcoin is going to go up much more than gold did. There's also more liquidity flowing around the system than there was in 2004. I also wonder what happens to Bitcoin's cycles. I think the cycles get affected because of the amount of capital coming in. Bitcoin typically in the last cycle that me and you both just went through, our first cycle, there was about $25 to $30 billion in net inflows into Bitcoin during that cycle. With an ETF, you're unlocking $200 to $300 billion of inflows. So Bitcoin, for the first time in its history, is going to face a demand shock, which it's never experienced before. It's experienced a supply shock, but it's never experienced a demand shock. So we now have a supply shock combined with a demand shock, combined with more liquidity coming into the markets, combined with the tightening cycle that we've been over the last 2 years coming to an end, the Federal Reserve getting to the point of lowering interest rates. A lot is lining up here for Bitcoin price appreciation, which is why I decided to get on YouTube and remind people, or at least alert people to the fact that Bitcoin is going to price you out from getting to 1 Bitcoin. And if you are sitting there with low single-digit millions of dollars of net worth, your time is running out, right? I think, up to $5 million will be priced out this cycle. If you've got a $5 million net worth, you won't be able to afford more than 1 Bitcoin after this next cycle. And then the next cycle after that, 2028 cycle, would price out somewhere between $5 and $12 million in net worth. And then it just goes to ultra high net worth by 2032.
Wow. It's crazy to think that. I mean, there's always these memes that float about, which goes like, there's something like 42 million millionaires around the world, and not everyone can acquire a Bitcoin. And now they've got the vehicle potentially that would give them the comfort that will say, not only like the institutional rubber stamp, so to speak, say, hey, this is a legitimate asset class. And hey, by the way, it's the best performing asset out of 6 of the last 8 years. And you don't have to worry about all the custody and the headaches associated with that. It's got a great brand behind it. Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens. What are your thoughts in relation to kind of the self-custody versus the ETF in terms of different pricing? I've heard sort of thoughts around there is a possibility in the future, and maybe it's not in the next sort of 5 to 10 years, but sort of 20 years out, where there might be, Bitcoin is fungible, but it might be the case of, well, hey, the self-custody Bitcoin is more valuable than the ETF, because it's almost as if the money in the ETF could be a bit like Hotel California, in the sense of, like, once your money's in there, it's not going to come out in the form of Bitcoin. You could get cash back, but you'll never
Yeah,
be able to actually.
I think that's the wet dream of certain Bitcoin maxis, and I think that'll be completely irrelevant within probably the next US political administration, because whoever's going to come in next is going to realize that the market's been cleaned up by Gary Gensler, and we can now convert these from cash creates and cash redemptions to in-kind, in and out. So therefore, you will be able to take out Bitcoin from the ETFs, just like you can do with the GLD ETF. So yeah, I think that's, there's a lot of Bitcoin companies right now that are basically staring their maker in the face, because they're about to get completely destroyed. Their value is about to get completely destroyed because the institutions are now here. It's not like anyone warned them about this, right? But you got Bitcoin companies, right? Bitcoin only companies backed by bullshit venture capital companies that are basically looking for an exit return, not realizing that even though they're charging a 1% fee, Fidelity is going to charge 0.39% to hold your Bitcoin in the ETF. You don't have to worry about custody. You don't have to worry about anything. And they're facing their maker. I believe half of these Bitcoin only companies are going to go out of business by the next cycle, because their VCs
sorry to interrupt. Are you talking about exchanges, or are you talking about like
anyone?
Yeah.
Anyone, every single one of them, right? They're going to get screwed, because if you own physical Bitcoin, you're now going to, so let me ask you a question, right? If you own physical Bitcoin versus you own the same amount of the ETF, and I say physical, you know what I mean by that,
Yeah.
right? Like self-custody Bitcoin versus the ETF, you own the same amount, $100,000 in each one. You say to me that you want to do some borrowing, right? Against your Bitcoin. And I say, well, if you want to borrow against the self-custody Bitcoin, I'm going to charge you an interest rate of 14%. If you want to borrow against your ETF Bitcoin, I'm going to charge you 3%. Which one are you doing?
Well, I mean, that's an easy one. But why would they make the distinction, though, in the first place, in your
Because
mind?
it's very simple. I got so much less regulation to deal with. I got so much less risk to deal with. The ETF structures are already present. I can go and borrow against my QQQ or SPY holdings right now, instantly. So all of the rails are there. It becomes much more safer for the banks and the institutions to lend against the ETF. And that's just how the system has worked. So Bitcoin is going to be adopted into the system. This is the process of securitization, which is what I've been talking about. And then you've got Bitcoin companies right now funded by bullshit venture capital firms that are basically shitcoin companies that are running a negative burn rate on a yearly basis, hopefully waiting for somebody to be acquired so they can generate return for their investors. And now they've got an ETF that's basically undercutting their top line fee by 2/3, right? It's just these companies are going to be bought off for their customer lists. That's it. There's going to be so much destruction of value in Bitcoin venture capital in the next, I would say, 5 to 10 years. There will also be a lot of creation of value, because it will get concentrated. And that's really the key to, if you're thinking about Bitcoin venture capital, it's looking at, okay, which companies are at threat as a result of the ETF? It's exchanges, because retail doesn't give a shit, right? Most of retail that holds most of the capital in their hands don't care about self-custody, right? Because they've never had to self-custody any of their assets. So they're extremely comfortable holding US ETFs because of the regulatory environment around it. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that's what it is. You've then got, so then you go, okay, what's the other market? Well, the other market is we can do institutional purchasing. Well, okay, but as you pointed out, 70% of the ETF applications are holding their Bitcoin and buying their Bitcoin through Coinbase. So Coinbase has already won the institutional. So if you're a company and you're a small business that makes, I don't know, let's say you make 20 million a year and you want to buy your Bitcoin, are you going to go to the number one institutional Bitcoin provider in the market, or are you going to go to some new upstart? What are you going to do? You're going to go to Coinbase, right? So all of these, there's a lot of shift that's coming here. And also, there's also tier 1 and tier 2 solutions to owning their Bitcoin. Right now, a lot of institutional capital has gone into companies like the Bitcoin mining companies, MSTR, and all these other options as an alternative to holding Bitcoin because they didn't want to go through the self-custody process. What happens to those? Right? Those are basically tier 2 solutions acting like tier 1 solutions. Tier 1 solution is the ETF or the self-custody Bitcoin. That's it. Tier 2 solutions are now the companies that add 3 or 4 layers of risk to holding that underlying Bitcoin. So what happens to those? I think there's going to be value destruction in those, and it's going to be interesting to see how this changes. Anyone who tells you that the Bitcoin ETF is a small part of how the market structure works over the next 3 to 5 years is a mental midget. They don't understand how damaging this is going to be to certain things that have formed the basis of the Bitcoin space, so to say, over the last 3 to 5 years.
Interesting. Yeah. And I think what you're really referring to here is that the weight of capital doesn't care about Bitcoin maximism, doesn't care about Bitcoin principles. And when you think about, and this is something that I heard in a recent podcast, where most of the wealth is held by boomers. Boomers are not going to be the ones lining up to try and buy from the Coinbases or the Swans or any of the Bitcoin only exchanges. They've got these familiar channels. They've got brokers. They can literally pick up the phone, or if they're doing everything online themselves, they can literally just pull the trigger on one of their brokerage accounts. So, and that's the weight of capital. So it feels in some ways, whether or not Bitcoin maxis like it or not, at least the sort of cultural, ideological types, it's evolving and it's going to evolve. And there will be aspects of the culture that are going to fundamentally change forever. And the idea of, sort of the whole world being orange pilled, in the sense of embracing all of the values that Bitcoiners embrace, low time preference and all that thing, I don't necessarily see that as being the case. Perhaps this is even a question that you could answer here is, when you think about Bitcoinization or hyperbitcoinization rather, and what that looks like in the future, how do you describe that, or how do you imagine that? I'd be interested to get your thoughts around that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what happens after 50 years, right? So I can only talk about the next 50 years. The next 50 years, hyperbitcoinization is going to work the same way that real estate worked, which is people are using it effectively as an investment and savings technology. And then there's going to be some form of alternative of fiat currency. Now, the best way that I can see this being implemented, just the smoothest way to keep capital revolving around the world, is you have some form of CBDC, and you have a wallet that goes between US dollars and Bitcoin, and as and when you need to, you move between one or the other and immediately generate liquidity and spend it into the world. This is, by the way, how it's supposed to work, because money is not US dollars, right? Money is the savings, is the gold, is the real estate, is the Bitcoin, it's that, right? That's real money. And then currency is what you use to activate the money that you have in the economy when you want to spend it. And the problem that we have now is that the bridge between the currency and the money is so complicated that most people are subjugated by that blockage. Whereas Bitcoin frees up that blockage. Bitcoin, you can go between US dollars and Bitcoin in multiple times a day without any issues. And that's the beautiful thing about Bitcoin. And I think that's the bridge. After 50 years, I don't know. I didn't know that ChatGPT was going to come around last year. So I don't know what's going to happen in 50 years. But so far, that's my thought process. I don't think, people always talk about El Salvador and stuff like that. And that's cool. But I always have to remind people that if you go read the law, like I actually read the law in El Salvador regarding the Bitcoin law, it's Bitcoin referenced in US dollars, which means that they've taken a commodity and allowed you to transact on it because they've just removed the capital gains on it.
Yeah.
But really, the currency is still US dollars. It's not Bitcoin currency just yet.
Totally. And and that point is something that I like to bang home as well, because, coming from a sort of legal background, when I look at Bitcoin, I go, what prevents me from wanting to spend it, aside from being greedy and saying, hey, I'd rather accrue that purchasing power myself and actually spend my fiat, which is melting, there's the capital gains issue and the complete ball ache of having to now try and account for every single purchase. And I certainly like to support Bitcoiners who are doing things. And, I buy honey, for example, with sats and that sort of thing. But Generally speaking, I don't see the use case for me at this point, and I
It's not
certainly
there yet.
don't. Hey,
It's not there yet.
yeah, and also, I mean, I also just think that like the idea that somehow Bitcoin is going to be the single unit of account for the entire globe, and that all 160 fiat currencies are going to just disappear doesn't seem like it will happen in my lifetime. But yeah, to your point, like, I mean, who knows?
Hey, there's a word for it. There's a word for it. It's called delusion. That's what it sounds like.
I think as long as there's governments, there's fiat, because they're always going to want it. I think Bitcoin will remain an asset and will continue to accrue purchasing power, and it'll be less volatile. You know, it'll be like gold at some point in its history. But yeah, I don't see that happening. Let's go back to an earlier point you made, because when you're talking about sort of the weight of capital that could potentially come in, and we don't know how much is necessarily going to come in.
No,
Like, I
I'll
know,
tell you. I'll tell you right now.
oh
I'll tell
yeah,
you right now. Top 500 asset managers in the world. By the way, what's the total market cap of Bitcoin approximately right now?
is it like
It's like
800?
700. Yeah, let's go 700-800 billion dollars, right?
Yeah.
The top 500 asset managers in the world, right? 500 people, right? Like you could probably fit 500 people into any conference room that you can find anywhere you're at, right? 500 people control $130 trillion.
Mm-hmm.
And guess who they all answer to? BlackRock, right? Just they answer to BlackRock, because BlackRock is the downstream effect of this is the direction that BlackRock is moving in. So therefore, if I tell my clients to go in the direction that BlackRock is moving in, I can't be fired for that. So therefore, de facto, no matter who their boss is, the ultimate boss is still BlackRock, right? And Fidelity and all these other guys that have Bitcoin ETF applications. $130 trillion. If they move just 1% of that capital over the next 10 years into Bitcoin, that's double Bitcoin's market cap right now. Just
Sure.
think about that. That's double the total market cap of Bitcoin right now. It's $1.3 trillion coming in. But the problem with Bitcoin is, for all of them, is that Bitcoin has something called a multiplier effect, right? So in order to if you put $1 into Bitcoin, the market cap doesn't just go up by $1. It actually, based on Bank of America's research, goes up by $118 when the supply is really squeezed. So $1 trillion, 1% movement of that top 500 asset managers takes the market cap of Bitcoin to $100 trillion, which is roughly $4.7 million of Bitcoin. This doesn't include a single dollar coming out of any of the $330 trillion that's locked in real estate right now.
Jeez. And what about bonds? You know what I mean? Like, I mean, I think at some
Doesn't
point,
include a single penny coming out of the $120 trillion in bonds in the US.
never mind
This
the
is
negative
just,
yielding
well,
bonds
no,
there.
actually, let me correct myself. They will, because that part of that 130 trillion that is under management is in bonds, but it's not the full amount, because the entire bond market is worth about that, right?
Yeah.
In the US. So yes, money will come out of bonds, will come out of equities, but it doesn't need to be much to move the price of Bitcoin to where people would just be completely and utterly blown away by it.
My God. And then, I suppose going back to where I sort of was going down this path here earlier. So we're saying, all right, we've got this weight of institutional capital that's going to be changing the culture. It's going to be driving the price exponentially higher for the coming decade. What about the idea of nation states acquiring Bitcoin as confiscation-proof savings? We saw what happened with Russia, and having their assets effectively seized, 500 billion. Is there a chance that Bitcoin self-custody would be useful for those crowds who go, hold on, we don't want the US being able to drive what we do over here. Let's take a hedge here. Yeah.
Of course, because it's in essence, like, now this is obviously more conspiratorial thinking. Okay. So, if I was to think about it, I could build an argument in my mind where Bitcoin is the single best way to transact in US dollars around the world without the ability for sanctions affecting it, because it is an unsanctionable asset. Right? Because let's say I'm sanctioned for doing business. Say I'm Russia and I'm sanctioned for doing business with Iran, for example, right? Well, now I have to transfer my oil to them in our currencies, because there's no one that's going to do that transfer. But how do you sanction Bitcoin? right? So I can go to Iran and say, right, this is worth X amount of US dollars and still get US dollars for it. It's one way or the other, whether it's in cash or whatever else, even if it doesn't go through the banking system. But I can actually reference it in US dollars without devaluing the value of the asset. Because what they have to do with their oil is they've got to price it in rubles and then devalue it because of the currency risk that people have actually, converting their treasury into rubles to make the transaction. But I can just do it in dollars. I can reference it in dollars because there's no risk of the reference on the asset. So, again, I haven't got fixed thoughts on this, but I think it certainly turns into a way. Everything that a normal person can do, a nation state needs to do, 10 times more than any one of us would even think about doing it. So, yeah, I think a nation state, but fuck the nation states. Just it's terrifying enough just to think what happens when this capital gets unlocked. Then now we're going to start thinking about nation states coming into Bitcoin. We're talking at that point, we're talking about, multi millions of dollars per Bitcoin just based on the supply constraint. Because the one thing that people don't realize is with Bitcoin, all these people tell me, oh, as Bitcoin goes up, people are going to sell. Well, if that's the case, why does the HODL rate keep going up? Right? As the price goes up, the HODL rate goes up because the sophistication of the owning improves as the price of an asset goes up. So, like, for example, when I came into the market and bought my Bitcoin from whoever I bought it from, they were trading at that time. I'm never selling. When Saylor bought his, when MicroStrategy bought their 186,000 or whatever it is Bitcoin from people that were trading in the market, they're never selling now. So the sophistication of the buyer is improving. The HODL rate is going up while the price is going up. And we're talking about $130 trillion of capital being unlocked before we start tapping into the real estate market that's out there. And now we want to talk about fucking nation states. What are we trying to do here? This is the recipe. This must be Bitcoin Viagra right here. This is what we're doing.
It is Bitcoin Viagra. So would you be so bold as to put forward like a little bit of a potential projection or price target for this cycle? What do you think the top's going to look like?
Yeah, I did a video on this, and I said I think we go without an ETF 280,000. With an ETF, I think it goes to somewhere in the region of 450,000.
Ooh-wee. And from a valuations perspective, when you're thinking about valuing Bitcoin, and when you talk to, I guess, people in TradFi or other high net worth individuals, how do you go about just providing them with a framework? Because I tend to just do the sort of, well, here's the total market cap of all store value things. What percentage of that can Bitcoin suck up? What monetary premium can it suck away from these things? So, is that how you look at it? And do you look at it in other ways too?
Yeah, that's how I look at it. You can't really look at it as a cash flow alternative right now. Once the ETF comes out, Bitcoin turns into a cash flow asset because the normal retail person doesn't know this, but an institutional person can use an ETF to generate cash flow by using the derivatives attached to the ETF, right? So a sophisticated fund can put $100 million into Bitcoin, sell some call options against it, and make 2% a month. They're making $2 million a month while owning that Bitcoin. This is just completely normal in the world that I come from, but it's not normal to the people that own real estate. You can basically generate a cash flow from holding Bitcoin as soon as it turns into an ETF. But yeah, the way that I look at it is just basically store of value. I think it's the easiest way to look at it. Cash flow option is not really there right now, but the store of value is terrifying enough because think about it, what you just said, right? How much can Bitcoin take from any one of these things? The thing that you didn't mention is the fact that the US dollar is going to continue expanding, right? Your thought process in your model takes into account the fact that the US dollar stops printing, right?
Yeah,
We're not even talking about the acceleration of printing that the US is about to go through because of the amount of debt that they have already, right? It's only going to accelerate. And then what happens when a higher and higher percentage of this new capital starts coming into Bitcoin? We're not even talking about that. We're talking about the $900 trillion US gorilla just stopping and taking pieces from what's already there. We're not even talking about the next, $10 trillion that's going to be printed.
Wow. Yes, it's almost like that's the low-hanging fruit. And there'll be all these other interesting sort of adoption stories and potential pathways, but fundamentally the ETF and the weight of institutional money is what's really going to drive, and that's going to probably be the main narrative for the cycle. And then we'll sort of maybe there'll be interesting stuff down the track. Just sort of conscious of time here, British. So last kind of topic I'd love to just touch on before we roll is just crypto.
Sure.
So, it's something that kind of I try the C word. It's the worst C word in my
Trying to get
household.
me as angry as possible before we say bye. Okay. All right,
Yeah, I
let's do this.
know. I have a special distaste for crypto just due to the fact that I perceive it to be a lot of false marketing and of just, liquid venture capital tokens without disclosures. Interested to get your thoughts on sort of how you describe crypto versus Bitcoin to, again, people who are now wanting to wet their, beaks. And then at the same time, do you think that crypto is going to have a run in this next cycle?
Yeah, I mean, listen, look, I don't care whether crypto, I'll answer that question first. I don't care whether crypto has a run in this next cycle because my purpose for allocating my capital is to protect the value of the energy that I have generated. And for that, Bitcoin is the only thing that has actually solved the problem. Crypto is promising to solve a problem. It's promising that one day I'll be able to take this crypto, turn it into something else, and then allow somebody to take it and use it for something. And hopefully I'll get paid for it. And it will be a utility, et cetera, et cetera. As far as I'm concerned, in all my life experience, I've never seen utilities go up in value. They go down. They go down in price, right? They don't go up in value. So as far as I'm concerned, that's what's going to happen with crypto. I've not seen a single crypto actually have any active value today in the real world. I don't think the crypto world can interface with the real world. I don't think there's a reason for decentralization besides decentralizing money. I think most UIs are much better when they're centralized and there's a company or people that are held accountable for keeping the UI the way it is. And if you want any evidence of that, all you got to do is study the fucking trend of Nostr last year when everyone was going on about Nostr. And I basically said, this doesn't make any sense. I'm going to stick to Twitter. I'm glad I didn't waste the hours that people wasted trying to waste their damn lives on Nostr when Twitter is just absolutely amazing, right? Because there's a group of people there that have made an investment that are being held accountable for keeping that environment growing. So yeah, I don't see any value for crypto for my portfolio because I know what my objective is. My objective isn't with Bitcoin. It's not to speculate. My objective is to protect the value that I've generated. I don't think any crypto has proven to me that it has solved any problem. And the worst part about it is they're all securities because if you were going to use it for something, you'd just use it for something, but they're not. They're basically saying, hey, buy this token so one day in the future we can generate some fucking value for you, hopefully by solving some problem. But none of it makes any sense. Smart contracts don't make any sense to me. None of it. If it stays in the digital world, there might be like some thing in the future that makes any sense. But I come from the real world, and in the real world, there's nothing that I've seen that can interact with the real world for the purpose of utilizing it to generate any real value. Oh, you want to give me an NFT so I can go inside of a concert? What the fuck's wrong with a ticket?
But it's a collector's item. Come on, British. Don't be so close-minded.
Oh, yeah. Now what we're going to do, right? Because we're all such NPCs, is we're going to now collect the tickets and we're going to trade the tickets for the concert that we didn't see. Like, just think about how stupid all of this is. Like, the only generation that could come up with this is this current generation of 20 to 30-year-olds that are basically NPCs. That's it. That's the only generation that could come up with the idea of you didn't go to the concert, but guess what? You can own the ticket that allowed someone to get into the concert.
Yeah.
No other generation is ever going to come out with that shit.
Yeah, and I often think about that Offspring song, the kids are going to be all right, or the kids aren't all right, or whichever way it is. And they're not all right. They especially, and this is just touching on a cultural point, didn't expect to go, yeah, but like, think of what's happened in Harvard and all these places over the last little while. There's quite a lot of evidence to say that there's been this indoctrination of non-thinking over the last 20, 30 years. And so the current crop of people we have coming out of these institutions are hopeless NPCs.
Ridiculous.
No, it's
And I'll tell you, there's this funny video. I got to tell you this funny shit. I didn't expect to go here either. But it's funny. There's this funny video, right? Where somebody walks in and there's a camera following that person that walks into this place, right? It's like some private area in a university somewhere. And someone immediately gets triggered, right? Runs up to the person and goes, hey, you can't film in here. You can't be in here. You can't film in here. And the guy who's being videoed turns around, points at the person holding the camera and says, that's okay. He identifies as a video camera. And this
No.
person just doesn't know what to say. This NPC just doesn't know what to say and just turns around and walks away. Like, okay, I guess that's fine. It's like the stupidest shit on earth. This is why I tell like all the young people that I'm like, all the boomers are going to take your Bitcoin. Because while you're out here not creating any real value, trading on the markets, thinking that you're smarter than everyone, when 95% of professional traders lose money. The boomers are out here understanding that all they have to do is follow the 3 rules of Bitcoin, essentially, and that's it. They'll just hold it for the rest of their lives, put it in their trust, give it to their managers, and their kids will be taken care of. And you can go back to being the NPC that you are with the amount of fiat money that you were given for no fucking reason.
Oh, wow. Yeah. No,
Nature is
absolutely.
healing.
Yeah. Sorry, say that again.
Nature is healing. So I'm happy about that.
In the end, I tend to believe these things are cyclical, and we've almost reached peak clown world in some ways. Every time I think we've reached peak clown world, we reach a new peak, but I just tend to feel like these things move in cycles. And when you think of the current crop of leaders and some of the institutions, we're just seeing so much decay that, it's not surprising, excuse me, you see all these cultural conflicts. And I reckon, in the next 10 years, you'll see something completely different, because it's becoming comical. It's becoming, you can't make this up. If you can pick your gender, you may as well pick your species. I identify as a sort of a red-headed dwarf. I mean, it's getting really ridiculous, and we need to bring things back to reality. And I think, when I think of the madness, British, I mean, this is another thing. It's like prior to Bitcoin, I was sort of balls deep in the cultural war, because I also studied political philosophy. So I was like super interested. And then
You
eventually
were
I'm
the
like,
target market.
yeah, exactly. And I was like, these people are just making me angry. This is pointless. And so eventually focused my energy on something that gave me endless optimism and hope, because I kind of have a goal and said, by the time I'm 50, I don't want to have to work. I want to work always. I always like to be productive, but I want to do everything on my own time. Well, actually with Bitcoin, I think I can achieve that even sooner. And so in that sense, it's given me a lot of hope. And it's kind of my guiding star where I put all my energy, because everything else around the world, like you look at all the madness, the mainstream media, all that kind of stuff, drives me bloody mental. So I just tend to focus on Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's the good thing is that the world does move in cycles, and cycles are healing. The thing that concerns me, regarding this cultural conversation, is that I know that the clapback is going to take a lot shorter time, and it's going to be a lot more painful than the 15 years, 20 years it's taken for us to get here. Whenever you see a clapback in society, it's like 3 years, right? 2 or 3 years, which is a lot shorter. And when something is a lot shorter, it's a lot more violent, and it's a lot more aggressive, and it's a lot more. That's the part that I think about, right? Because all these motherfuckers are NPCs. They don't know what they're doing at this point, right? They've believed a bunch of garbage science, because now we have the Church of Science, right? They've believed a lot of this BS. And when the clapback comes, do you think they're just going to sit down and behave? So then what's going to happen in that process? I don't know. And that's the part that concerns me.
Wow. Yeah. It's almost like the analogy I was thinking as you were talking is like you're grabbing this rubber band and you're pulling it
Right.
over 15, 20 years. And then it's like, and this thing
Takes
just
a second.
shoots. And
Takes a
God
second.
knows what happens from there. And that's why I like, when I think sort of big picture, I look at different continents and different sort of geopolitical risks, whether you've got wars, you've got cultural conflicts. And for all its flaws, a lot of people don't like Australia. It's tyrannical, technocratic state. It's a nanny state, all this other bullshit. Look, it's got its problems as far as fuck from anywhere, but
It had to be a
it's
nanny state. We sent all of our prisoners over there. You got to keep an eye on them.
exactly, they're very dodgy. But for the most part, I can just say it's fairly benign. Politics is benign. It doesn't matter who's in power.
I think the reason why that happened for Australia particularly is because of exactly what you're saying, and then suddenly their reaction during the flu season. I think that's really like what made people go, wait a second, what is going on here? This is so unlike what we expect from Australia. But again, right now we got a demographic crisis. And I think in the next 20 years, I think a lot of the fear that's being generated politically is a bunch of BS. I don't think China's got the lead in any amount of way that everyone's talking about. I can't see any of that happening. I think the US is probably going to be the best place to be, with certain parts of Europe involved. The US just has to hold on for another 25 years. If the US can hold on to its position for another 25 to 30 years, you're seeing it in the demographic data. Republicans and conservatives are outbreeding liberals by 2 to 1 in the US.
Interesting.
And so, yeah, and generally speaking, your children are always gonna. And why do you think they want to control the kids, right? Like it's that is what does it. And now you're seeing the clapback happen. And you know the leader of the supreme leader of Harvard just quit. So you know all of this is going to happen. All of it's going to be a clapback. It's going to be insane. When I was in school, it was like 60% of the teachers were liberal. Now it's like 75% of professors are liberal leaning. And you know, I'm thinking about having kids in my future, and I don't want them to go to a school or be taught by people that are extreme one way or the other, right? The teacher is supposed to be, you know, giving you information and teaching you how to think, not sort of telling you what they think and why you should follow it. The good news that I had was that when I was younger, the question I would always ask my teachers is, how is this going to help me in the real world? Like, how is learning, you know, Pythagoras going to help me? It might help someone who, you know, wants to work in a particular field where you need Pythagoras.
Yeah.
But how's that going to help me in what I want to do, which is get rich, right? But a lot of people don't think like that anymore. And I will certainly, when I have children, they'll be told to question the shit out of everything. And I think that's the generation that's coming, and that's going to heal the world, because I think there's so many people that are telling their children to question things now. There's this lost generation in the middle that's like 20 to 30 on average, something like that. But I'm meeting so many young kids that are like, you know, 16 to 19 to 20 years old that look like they got their heads screwed on. And then older than that are realizing now that they've started working that capitalism is actually a good thing. Because you know that's the issue, right? That's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
issue. People don't work and they think capitalism is a bad thing. Then they start working and they realize, oh shit, it's actually quite good. So yeah, those 30-year-olds that have finally started working are like, wait a second, I kind of like capitalism. And the younger generation is obviously seeing the mistakes that their older brothers, aunties, cousins, whatever have made, and don't want to make those mistakes. So nature is healing, but I do worry about the clapback that's coming, because it is coming.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And, you know, we're also in an election year in the US, and that's always a bloody circus. And, you know, how they still continue to do that by hand. And, you know, you should be able to verify very quickly, instantaneously, like who basically won. But it's absolute chaos. The
Hey, maybe
borders
we
like
should use one of the
porous.
crypto. We should use one of the crypto ideas and
Use
put
the
all of the
blockchain.
elections on a blockchain. Whoa, that sounds like a great fucking idea.
Oh dear. But yeah, I do think ultimately nature's healing, but in the short run there's going to be a lot of pain and turmoil, and but I do still have a lot of hope. And I think these institutions are no longer serving us, the schools, even the medical establishment. Things have just been, when trust has been so badly violated, I think that's where the clapback, as you described, gets even more vicious. And new institutions are going to be born, and then we'll start learning to trust those instead. And I think, you know, when I'm a big fan of the US, and there's parts of the US that I wouldn't touch with a 10-foot barge pole, you know, but there's parts that I just know are like freedom frontiers, and they will never yield 1 inch to the socialist garbage. So,
The problem is, while I agree with you, and when I was younger, I wanted to move to the US. While I agree with you, they're proving it every single day that they do. Right? They might not yield as much as California does, for example, but Texas and Florida are yielding to certain extents, and they're yielding to extents that I don't agree with, but they're still yielding, right? They're still, you know, like you go to Austin in Texas, it's basically like being in California. So it's like, you know, there is a certain movement happening and a certain shift happening, and the identity of the state is being shaped by the people in it rather than the state itself. And that's what I'm so sad about my country, right? The United Kingdom is now being shaped by the people that are in it rather than the identity that everyone is supposed to align with by holding the passport of the United Kingdom. If you are a citizen of the United Kingdom, you should be holding and living up to the ideals. But the problem is people don't have any appreciation for where they come from. Right? My parents were lucky enough, or my dad's side was lucky enough to be accepted into the United Kingdom, all of my opportunities come from the United Kingdom. And yes, even though I'm Indian, I'm African Indian, but I'm still British. I was born in the United Kingdom. And my mom is from India, and I always have this debate with her over cricket, right? Which is all of my Indian side of the family is like, oh, you're not who are you supporting in England or India? And I always have to support England because while yes, technically I am Indian by ethnicity, I am British, and I will support the United Kingdom and everything that it stands for because it gave me all of my opportunities. And people don't have appreciation for that because unfortunately, everywhere in the world has just started feeling all right. Right. And that's got to change at some point. And I think that's going to start happening now. People start realizing which situations, which countries have the best systems, et cetera, et cetera. And we got to get back to remembering who the fuck we are.
Yeah, there's almost like a distinct lack of pride in, or civic pride, whether it's the States, whether it's the UK, the self-loathing. I see it here in Australia too, parts of New Zealand too. And I think, for someone like myself who's come from South Africa and immigrated like 5.5, 6 years ago now, you don't know what it's like on the other side. You don't know how bad things can be and how grateful you should be for where you come from. So, despite sort of locking us down for 2 years and having some sort of trauma around that period, I'm still ultimately incredibly grateful for the opportunity to come to Australia because it's literally, it is like a blank canvas of economic opportunity. Like if you're not a lazy ass, you can do something and it doesn't matter what you do. Like,
yeah, at least you got your property rights protected.
Exactly, as a starting point. So ultimately always very grateful, but there's no solutions, only trade-offs. Really loving this topic here and could chat for days, but thank you so much, British, for your time. Love the insights, particularly love the controversial takes because we got to have people who are thinking differently and, rattle the cage every now and then with, particularly the maxis. I call myself a maxi too, because, I've certainly, when I say bought into, but I embrace a lot of what Bitcoin ideology represents. But at times I need to sense check myself. I need people from the outside, the real world, engaging with the TradFi rails to kind of shake me up and say, listen, boy, this is how it works. Did you want to say any closing words today and then give the audience sort of a handoff as to where they can find you?
Yeah, no, all I want to say is my pleasure. Congratulations on the podcast. Congratulations on everything you're doing. We need more people talking about it. Time is running out. And, by the time they see this video, time might have already run out. Because if that ETF is live, I don't know what's going to happen between now and then. So hopefully that's happened. And we'll now, this is a glimpse from the from the pre-ETF world of Bitcoin for people. But yeah, no, I just want to say I'm proud of you. We need more people talking about Bitcoin. This is what I've been trying to do is just get more people hearing about Bitcoin in one way or another. And yeah, just keep it up. And if anyone wants to find me, all you got to do is very, very simple. You go to youtube.com and you type in British Hodl and you look for this face. That's it.
There we go. That's a great handle here. I mean, like, you got British Hodl, you got American Hodl. I don't
It's
know
because of America. It's because of American Hodl that I'm actually British Hodl.
Okay. Oh,
Yeah, because he was one of the first people I started talking to. It's like, when you're like, you start coming into a new space, right? And then you start talking to nutters in the space. And like American Hodl is like the nutter that just like is on Twitter going crazy, this, that, and the other. So I started talking with him and I was like, let me try and figure out like what type of person this is called American Hodl. And I love him. I love his family. And he's the one who inspired me to put my name as British Hodl.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I'm looking forward to chatting to him one day because he's also one of my top guys. British, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate you. And I can't wait to see what 2024 has in store for us.
My pleasure, my friend.
Cheers.